Okay, so now we have presentation of Nikos Potamianos. Chris.
Tell me if you can see my PowerPoint. Yeah? Okay, thank you. So good afternoon. I'm going to present you rent control in Greece in its formative year, specifically in Athens. And I will speak from a social history perspective. Now, rent control, rent control in Greece was imposed for the first time in 1916 during the First World War. Initially applied in Athens and Piraeus, and eventually it was extended to other big cities. It was imposed in the same year with other measures against profiteering, which were intended to deal with the unprecedented rise of prices in essential goods. This rise would become much bigger after the end of the wars and economic crisis of 1929.
Can you do a full screen so that we can see a bigger version of your slides, please?
Yeah, let's see. It's okay? Is it okay now?
Yeah, it's okay. Thanks a lot.
So there is a skyrocketing inflation, and moreover, there is a housing problem in Athens that had aggravated in the previous years due to various reasons. Thus, labor unions began to demand rent control from 1914 onwards, but the main driving force behind the imposition of rent control was not the other weak unions, but the broader social pressure on the governments to protect people from high inflation. It was a juncture of intense political conflict, and governments had an additional motive to try to secure consent as better as they could, of course. The broader context of rent control is the rise of the state intervention. I do not have to say more about this. However, it was specifically this kind of state intervention in the market. It was rent control that was considered as a major attack against property. The restriction of the rights of property in the case of rent control was considered comparable with the extensive expropriation of big estates during the agrarian land reform of 1917-1925, which was one of the more radical agrarian reforms in this period in Europe, outside the Soviet Union. Actually, the League for the Defense of Property, that was formed in the early 1920s, focused on the rights of proprietors exactly in these two cases: urban landlords hit by rent control and owners of big rural estates that were expropriated. Perhaps one would think that there is an element of exaggeration here as regards the threats for urban property. Nevertheless, landlords of houses that were subjected to rent control undoubtedly suffered an important loss of income in the context of big inflation that followed the war. According to an estimation of the cost of living in 1925, the increases of the rent of the houses that were subjected to rent control were 350%, while the increase of average consumer prices, the whole inflation, amounted to 1,200%. Which were the specific terms of rent control in Greece? The law of 1916 banned the eviction of a tenant who was paying the rent regularly, and it regulated the amount of the rent in favor of the tenant. Rents were frozen for 1 year, and then small increases were permitted every year. The moratorium on rents included commercial rents as well, shops and workshops. Eventually, new provisions were introduced in the next years as regards the families of soldiers, public servants, new houses, subletting a room or the whole apartment, or the provision that the owners had the right to evict the tenant if they were to reside in the house themselves. It should be stressed here that rent control was always considered a temporary measure, even after the end of the wars, and until 1927, had to be renewed annually. And after 27, it had to be renewed every 3 years. Consequently, every year, a public discussion was taking place on its overall usefulness and on its specific terms. And it was a kind of a constant negotiation which contributed to the formation of associations of landlords and tenants, while other stakeholders, such as blue-collar and white-collar unions, represented the interests of their members regarding the issue as well. Now, the focus of my paper is exactly on these social groups, the organizations that represented them, the collective action and the views expressed on the subject in the first years of rent control, when, as I told you, a kind of a negotiation procedure was created, and for not a proper negotiation mechanism. Let me begin from the landlords. Small owners formed a very important part of the owners of small houses and apartments. The domination of small property in Greece constituted one, it is said to constitute one of the peculiarities of Greek social structures until very recently. It still does to a lesser extent. Of course, horizontal property, condominium, was introduced only in 1929. Before this year, the landlords owned whole buildings, not single apartments. However, the buildings were usually small. Most houses had 1 or 2 rooms, particularly in working class neighborhoods. And it was many peasants, shopkeepers, craftsmen, or even ex-servants that could afford to own a house. Characteristically, the common practice was to build houses gradually, adding rooms or floors when the owner had found some money. Moreover, the land around Athens that was gradually transformed from agricultural to urban plots as the city grew belonged to a large extent not to big landowners, but to peasants who built their houses for themselves and to let. Actually, there was a group of small proprietors who depended exclusively on their income from rent, many of them being widows or other lower middle class women, as well as old men and women who had invested their savings in a house in order to have a regular income when they retired in an age that pensions had not yet been established. It was this last category of small owners, small proprietors relying on their income from the rent. It was this last category that always emerged in the discourse of the landlords' associations in order to legitimize their demands. The argument was that not all the proprietors were rich, so one should not automatically consider rent control as a fair measure in favor of the lower and middle class. It is clear, however, that the associations of the landlords were dominated by wealthy people. Thematikos Sύνδεσμος, League of Landowners of Athens, was founded in 1908, intervening in issues such as taxes on land. Its board was comprised of merchants and various well-known big proprietors. This did not change when membership increased in the following years. However, despite the fact that it was dominated by big landowners, small landlords felt that their interests were adequately represented by the association in the first years of rent control. And in 1917, we have 2,000 persons to participate in a rally in Athens for the abolition of rent control. Of course, they were demobilized after the entrance of Greece in the Great War, as it happened with all social movements and collectivities. In the next years, this association became a pressure group of a bourgeois moderate profile. It was a kind of a responsible interlocutor of the government who was tabling proposals for the modification and the improvement of rent control, but not its abolition. A new association of landlords came in 1922 to fill the gap, a bourgeois union of proprietors. In its first assemblies, thousands of people gathered with cries such as, "We want our houses back," and "Long live the Constitution that protected property." They denied government's concessions, and they called for a revolution against the Bolsheviks who rent our houses and the governments that protect those people. Now, although there were different attitudes, tactics, and levels of radicalism in the camp of landowners, they all agreed that property was a sacred right that formed the foundation of society, but was threatened from the social spirit of their times. It is noteworthy that while in 1916 their discourse was based on the principles of economic liberalism, they referred to free market, the laws of supply and demand, the notion of an absolute individual freedom. In the 1920s and 1930s, this has changed somehow. The emphasis now was put on a concept of property that was linked to other values and institutions, particularly family and nation, to give you some examples of their rhetoric. The property of houses was presented as a result of the Greek national character and its features of hard work, thrift, and saving. Tell me if this is a Greek peculiarity. It was presented as a bond with the land of the motherland, which, and the very possible loss of this bond, which would put national cohesion in danger. Family was derived from home in their discourse and not vice versa, and the grandeur in some of the Greek race was based on estate property. Overall, a deeply conservative ideology was developed by the associations of the landowners, and at times they were radicalized towards a far-right direction. Let me pass to the other side, the tenants. The Solidarity League of the Tenants was established in 1921 after a modification of rent control that was in favor of the landlords. Thousands of people gathered in its first rallies, among them many women. It should be stressed here that women were present also in the older food riots against high prices. And moreover, in these years, during and after the First World War, all over Europe, women formed, in some cases, the majority of the people who mobilized in protests about the high prices of food. Now, this could be attributed to two facts, I believe. Firstly, that women were largely not unionized and not yet enfranchised, and thus the repertoire of action that was available to them was mainly the pre-political and older one of food riots. And the second, high prices, was an issue that was closer to their responsibilities in the household, to the extent that in the male breadwinner family, women were responsible for provisions and consumption. Moreover, as regards specifically rent control, women were identified in this model with the house as a place. Still, women's presence in mobilizations about rents remains an important development as regards the entrance of women in public sphere and political life. The demands of the Tenant Solidarity League included the minimization of increases in rents, the longer duration of rent control, that is, of the freeze of rents. They asked for 5 years instead of 1. They asked that the subtenancy of 1 or 2 rooms would continue to be permitted without the agreement of the owner of the house, which seems that it was a common practice even before rent control, that the tenant would sublet the room without asking. And they also asked that the tenants would not be evicted even if the landlord wanted to use the house for himself or to build a bigger house as was provided by law. Actually, the more essential aim of them was to defend the very existence of rent control, as there were always voices arguing for the abolition of rent control in 1922, 1927, 1930. This became a very possible outcome, but it was finally prevented. Now, Tenant Solidarity League was not the only one, the only organization representing the tenant side. From the tenants' point of view, intervened labor unions, associations of white collars, as well as the confederations of tradesmen and small industrialists and craftsmen regarding the commercial rents. The League of the Tenants played here a unifying role in this camp, and in 1923, for example, it organized a big rally in which took part representatives of all the above organizations. However, there were differences in the positions taken by the various organizations, and the most important one was that labor unions, both those controlled by communists and those controlled by more conservative unionists, they proposed that substantial rent increases should be permitted for rents over a specific amount. That is, they proposed that rent freeze should be maintained only for the working class houses and the part of the lower middle class as well. And in 1921, the unions preferred to organize a demonstration of their own at the same day that the Tenant Solidarity League rallied for issues of rent control. And this way, they underlined that they had different views. Yet, despite these frictions, there was a clear dividing line that defined the two opposite camps, a line that was based on the possession or the lack of property. This dividing line was expressed in ideological and cultural terms as well. If house owners were unified under a common perception of property as the base of social order, of all social institutions, and of all national virtues, tenants, white and blue collar workers, public servants, small shopkeepers, and artisans, they all converged in using a particular political discourse that was developed in these years of high inflation. That is, in using what I have called elsewhere the idiom of shameful profiteering. Both communist workers and conservative judges use the same violent discourse against, I quote, the unjustified profiteering of the landlords who form a new kind of blackmailers and greedy usurers. Actually, this is discourse of a public servant. Now, I will finish this presentation by suggesting that an appropriate way to conceptualize this discourse, these views, is to use a classic concept of social history, that of moral economy. Moral economy has been introduced by A.P. Thompson back in 1971 to describe the response of the 18th century English crowd to the shortages and the rise of prices in food, in prices of grain, in times of crisis. There is no time, of course, to say much about moral economy. I will also say that what Thompson describes is a very peculiar set of values, ideas, and repertoire of action that characterizes specifically this time and place. But, however, the use of the concept has been extended by many others to various other times and countries, and this has modified the concept. Myself, I intend to keep the emphasis of the original definition of moral economy by Thompson, the emphasis on the lower classes' demand to regulate prices on the basis of earlier arrangements. And I would also follow Roberto Bianchi, who spoke of a new moral economy that emerged during the First World War and its aftermath, in the context of the vast state regulation of prices. This regulation, this extended state intervention, provided a model for workers and lower strata in general, who demanded such controls to be imposed again or to become better, more strict, or permanent. My argument is that this kind of protest culture, which has been studied in several countries as regards the discourse against profiteering, food specifically, is that this culture constituted the broader context of the imposition of rent control as well. And at any rate, it contributed crucially to the legitimization of a more intense state intervention in the economy. Of course, the increase of state intervention is a complex question. I'm sure Alexander has a lot to say about this. I will finish by saying only that landlords too had a discourse that was full of moral values and that moralized an economic issue. But I would rather keep the concept of moral economy for the tenants, that is, for a mobilization that was challenging the principles of free market and the rights of property in favor of the collective well-being. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nikos. Any questions so far? I have one question. Looking into experience of different countries, I found quite a few cases of rent strikes. So the situations when renters didn't pay rents because they wanted to, I don't know, some rent reduction or introduction of rent control. Do you have such examples in Greece? And whether you can see the dynamics of this protest movement? For example, it concentrated around some big events like wars, I don't know, earthquakes, whatever. And then after these big events leveled off, the protest movement also goes down. Thank you.
Okay, that's a nice question. I don't know if Greece is well, no, I have not found any rent strikes in Greece. I guess that it was this link of tenants that would have organized any of them, but they did not. And it's this is an interesting question. Why this did not happen in Greece as well? I think that, and this brings me to the other thing you asked about the dynamics of the protest movement. As I told you, there was a very high inflation in these years. And what was the overarching band in the course of almost all social movements of these years was the issue of high prices in food, in essential goods in general. So there was a very aggressive discourse against profiteering. And I have seen this from studying merchants and shopkeepers, which were the victims, let's say, of this discourse. And the way they answered, of course, okay, this was a simplifying way to see what was happening in the economy, but it was, I think, it was a way to build an anti-capitalist foundations of intellectual foundations of political protest. It was a way to express some anti-capitalist sentiments by accusing merchants. Perhaps it would not take them too far in dealing with high prices, but I think that in general it was it did push things in order to so that the governments adopted some measures that would make the situation better.
Hi, thanks. I have a question. I apologize if you mentioned something about this. Maybe the audio was not perfect at certain points. I wondered if you found any evidence on the position taken in this dispute by industrial employers, which in Italy, for example, were in the same period in a very difficult position because they, of course, had to defend property in principles, but they really wanted the rents to be lower.
Okay, this is, I think you spoke about this in your paper in the last workshop. Actually, in Greece, no, I have not found any. I mean, the employers, the industrialists are very clear. They defend property. They're very clear in this. Maybe this has to do with the different patterns of industrial development in the two countries. I mean, it was in Greece, the industry was not yet much developed, and there still were many close relationships between industrialists and other forms of entrepreneurs. So, I mean, although also financial relationships. So maybe their interest was not that much based on low wages, but it was also based on keeping commercial prices high. But this is something I should study more about this. Thank you.
We have just 0 minutes, but anyway, allow me the freedom to ask the last question. We heard about the quite not very nice experience in Israel with subletting. And you mentioned that in Greece, prior to rent control, there was already the practice of subletting without permission of landlord. Did you have some kind of problems as Israel did with its tenants, subletting at higher rents than they were letting from landlords themselves?
Yeah. Well, this is something one reads often in the newspapers, things about this. I want to be careful about the size of the phenomenon, about the extent to which this was happening. I think that in general, you have to be careful when approaching a phenomenon, not by data that could be quantified, but by the discourse of parts that are involved, right? This was a key argument of the landlord's side. I'm sure that it happened. I don't know how much and how important was it as a phenomenon. I'm not sure how one could really investigate this. But yes, one can read various protests in the newspaper, landlords about this. And one of the main arguments of the landlords is also that there are many tenants who are rich and should not be protected by the rent control. And this is the basis on which the tenants as well develop other arguments. Some of them include, as I told you, proposals that restrict control in working class houses, and not in all cases. But in general, the law was quite horizontal. I mean, it provided for all housing, but it seems that they differentiated a bit as regards the increase of rents, differentiated on whether some tenants could be objectively rich. If one could prove that his tenant was rich, he would be able to raise the rent quite a lot. But I do not really know how all this works. I mean, I have seen the laws, but of course, yes, there is this problem how to find how the laws really work. But thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. By the way, your last comment rhymes very well with the proposal of Mayor of Berlin to peg the rent or set maximum rent at 30% of the income of the tenant. So
yeah,
you see that more than 100 years ago, and now the problems remain the same at the rental market. Okay, so thanks a lot for today's sessions. Tomorrow we'll have the last one with 4 different presentations. So please, we'll be happy to see you again tomorrow and to listen to these presentations. For today, it's over. For those who are participating online, for those who are participating offline, we have a privilege of having a conference dinner. So probably next time when you come to Berlin, we can do it together.
right.
And yeah, I wish you all the best and see you, probably some of you, or maybe all of you tomorrow. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.